My name is Ben Carter. I'm 57 years old, and for 30 of those years, I was a conservation officer with the West Virginia Division of Natural Resources. I've spent more nights in the woods than most people have spent in their own beds. I've tracked poachers through rhododendron thickets so dense you'd swear the sun gave up trying to get through. I've faced down cornered black bears, dealt with rabid coyotes, and pulled more than my share of lost hikers out of the Monongahela National Forest. I say all this not to brag, but to establish a fact. I am not a man given to flights of fancy. I know the woods. I know the animals that live there. Or at least, I thought I did. The trip was an annual tradition. The second week of November, just before rifle season kicked into high gear. My best friend Cal and I would rent a cabin somewhere remote, get away from everything, and do some late-season bow hunting.
Cal was as seasoned as I was, a retired Army sergeant who moved with a quiet efficiency that always put me at ease. This year, though, the dynamic was different. Cal had brought along his nephew Brian and Brian's new girlfriend, Alyssa. Brian was in his late 20s, full of that particular brand of confidence that comes from reading a lot of books about a subject without ever getting your hands dirty. He was an IT guy from Charleston, and he viewed the trip as a sort of rugged LARPing experience, complete with brand new, top-of-the-line gear that still had the creases in it. Alyssa was even more out of her element. A sweet girl, a first-grade teacher, but her idea of roughing it was a motel without complimentary breakfast. She looked at the towering hemlocks and dark hollers with a wide-eyed apprehension she was trying very hard to hide. The cabin was deep in Tucker County, miles down a winding gravel road that branched off the main route to Blackwater Falls.
It was advertised as secluded, which was an understatement. The road ended at the cabin. Beyond it, there was nothing but 100,000 acres of national forest. It was a proper log structure, solid and well-built, with a wide front porch and a big stone fireplace. A plume of wood smoke was already curling from the chimney when we pulled up. The owner always left a fire going for new arrivals. It felt welcoming, safe. "End of the line, folks," Cal announced, killing the engine of his Ford F-250. The sudden silence was immense, broken only by the whisper of wind through the skeletal branches of the oaks and maples. The leaves were mostly down, carpeting the ground in a thick, damp blanket of rust and gold. The air had that clean, cold bite of late autumn, smelling of wet earth and wood smoke. Brian was the first one out, stretching dramatically. "Man, breathe that in. You can't get air like this in the city." He clapped Cal on the shoulder. "Good pick, Uncle Cal.
This is legit." Alyssa slid out of the truck more cautiously, pulling her fleece jacket tighter around herself and scanning the dense wall of trees that pressed in on the small clearing. I could see the city girl in her, calculating the distance back to civilization. We spent the first hour unloading, rifles in their cases, bows, coolers heavy with food and beer, duffel bags. Cal and I moved with the practiced economy of decades of doing this. Brian tried to help, grabbing bags with more enthusiasm than technique, nearly dropping a case of ammunition. "Easy, son," Cal said, his voice gentle but firm. "Treat everything like it's loaded." Brian just grinned, unabashed. "Got it, Uncle Cal. Safety first." Inside the cabin was perfect. A big open-plan living area with a kitchen, a long dining table, and a few comfortable-looking couches arranged around the hearth. A spiral staircase led up to a loft with a couple of beds, and 2 small bedrooms were tucked away in the back.
It was rustic but clean. I dropped my pack by the door and went to inspect the fireplace. A healthy bed of coals glowed beneath the fresh logs. Good. The temperature was already dropping as the afternoon sun sank lower in the sky. "All right, team," Cal said, rubbing his hands together. Ben and I will take the back rooms. Brian, you and Alyssa can have the loft. First order of business, get the rest of this gear stowed. Second order, crack open a beer. Third order, Ben and I are going to do a quick scout before we lose the light. You two can get settled.
Brian looked crestfallen. You're going out already? I wanted to check out my new rangefinder. He held up a complicated-looking piece of optical equipment. I recognized it from a catalog. It cost more than my first rifle. Plenty of time for that tomorrow, Bri, I said, trying to soften the dismissal. We just want to check the immediate area, look for sign. We'll be back in an hour, tops. I didn't add what I was really thinking, that I wanted to get a feel for the woods here without having to answer a constant stream of questions. I needed to let the forest speak to me, and it couldn't do that over a running commentary. He relented, and soon Cal and I were shrugging on our blaze-orange vests. I grabbed my bow, more out of habit than any real intent to hunt. Cal took his, a beat-up compound bow that had been his faithful companion for 20 years. We left the cabin, leaving Brian to explain the finer points of his new gear to a polite but visibly uninterested Alyssa. The air was colder now, the sun a pale disk behind the ridge to the west. The woods were quiet, but it was a natural quiet. The rustle of a squirrel in the leaf litter, the distant caw of a crow, the sigh of the wind. We walked a slow, meandering loop around the cabin, our boots making a satisfying crunch on the frosted leaves.
We were looking for game trails, rubs on trees, any indication of where the deer were moving. It was Cal who found it. He was 50 yards ahead of me, near the edge of a steep ravine choked with mountain laurel. He stopped dead and raised a hand. I moved up to join him, my steps suddenly more cautious. Cal was not a man for theatrics. If he stopped like that, he'd seen something. "What is it?" I whispered, my eyes scanning the trees ahead. "Down here," he said, his voice low. He pointed with his chin toward the base of a massive white pine. I followed his gaze and my stomach tightened. It was a deer, or what was left of one. A large doe by the look of it. But it was the nature of the scene that stopped my breath. I've seen hundreds of animal kills in my career. Bear kills are messy, torn apart with brute force. Coyote and dog kills are marked by bites and ripped flanks, a frantic, chaotic energy. This was different. The doe had been broken. Her neck was bent back at an impossible angle. The bone clearly snapped. Her rib cage was splayed open, but not ripped. It looked like it had been cracked and pulled apart, like you'd break open a lobster claw. The internal organs were gone, but the surrounding area wasn't a mess of gore. It was almost neat. The main muscle groups of the haunches and shoulders were gone, stripped clean from the bone. What was left of the hide was peeled back in large, almost surgical flaps. There were no drag marks, no sign of a struggle, just this grotesque, shattered tableau. "Bear?" I said, but the word sounded hollow as soon as I said it. I walked closer, my boots sinking into the soft soil near the carcass. There was a faint, musky odor in the air, a gamey, wet dog smell that was somehow different from the usual scents of the forest. It made the hairs on my arms stand up. "No bear did this," Cal said, his voice flat. He squatted down, pointing at the ground. "Look at the tracks." I knelt beside him. The leaf litter was disturbed, but the damp earth beneath held a few partial impressions. They weren't bear tracks. They weren't deer or coyote or bobcat. They were huge. One partial print near the doe's head was as long as my hand and wider. It was vaguely canine, but wrong. The shape was too elongated, the pad impressions too deep, as if bearing an immense weight. And there were only two of them that were clear,
suggesting something that had stood over the kill, on two legs. My mind scrambled for a rational explanation. A deformed bear? A prank? Poachers with a sick sense of humor? None of it fit. The sheer strength required to snap a deer's neck like that, to crack a rib cage open. It was staggering. "What the hell makes a track like that?" I murmured, tracing the edge of one with my finger. It was deep, at least 2 inches into the soil. Whatever made it was heavy, unbelievably heavy. "I don't know," Cal said, and the simple honesty of his words was more chilling than any panicked theory. He stood up, his eyes doing a slow 360-degree scan of the surrounding woods. "But I don't like it. Not one bit." We stood there in the gathering twilight for another minute, the silence pressing in. The woods no longer felt welcoming. They felt watchful. The natural sounds had faded away. No squirrels, no birds, just a dead, heavy stillness. That was always the first sign of a major predator in the area. The entire forest held its breath. "Let's go back," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Now." We walked back to the cabin much faster than we had walked out. Every snap of a twig under our boots sounded like a gunshot. I kept glancing over my shoulder, my hand tight on my bow, a completely useless gesture against whatever could do that to a full-grown deer. The image of that broken doe was burned into my mind. When the warm yellow light of the cabin windows appeared through the trees, I felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost made my knees buckle. We burst out of the tree line and onto the cleared lawn, jogging the last few yards to the porch. Brian and Alyssa were on the couch, a game of Scrabble between them. They looked up as we came in, stamping the cold from our feet. "Whoa, you guys look like you've seen a ghost," Brian said with a laugh. "Find anything good?" Cal shot me a look, a silent order to downplay it. No need to spook the kids, not yet. "Just a deer carcass," Cal said, unzipping his vest. "Something got to it. Looked like a bear, maybe." He was a terrible liar, his voice a little too casual, but Brian bought it. "A bear? Awesome. Think it's still around? Maybe we can track it tomorrow." His eyes were bright with excitement. "No," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. "We're not tracking it. We're staying clear of that area. A fed bear is a dangerous bear." Brian's face fell, a flicker of petulant disappointment. "Oh, right. Sure." Alyssa, however, had picked up on our tension. "Is everything okay? You both seem jumpy." "We're fine, honey," Cal said, forcing a smile. "Just getting cold. Sun's down." He walked over to the fireplace and threw another log on, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The gesture was meant to be comforting, normal, but I saw his hand tremble, just for a second. Dinner was a quiet affair. Cal and I were lost in our own thoughts, replaying what we'd seen. Brian tried to liven things up with a story about his office IT department, but it fell flat in the heavy atmosphere. Alyssa just picked at her food, her eyes darting between me and Cal. She knew something was wrong. After we ate, Cal pulled me aside while the others were cleaning up. We stood on the back porch, the cold air a shock after the warmth of the cabin. The night was absolute pitch black beyond the small circle of light cast by the porch lamp. "That was no bear, Ben," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I know. Those tracks. It looked like a wolf stood on its hind legs. A giant wolf." "I know, Cal." I leaned against the railing, staring out into the oppressive darkness. The wet dog smell was back, faint but unmistakable on the night air. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was close. "What do we do?" he asked. "Pack up and leave?" Tell the kids we're cutting the trip short because we found a dead deer? Brian will never let it go, and Alyssa is already spooked. I thought about it. The rational part of my brain, the part that had been in charge for 30 years, was screaming that we were overreacting. It was a strange kill, yes, unexplained tracks. But we were two armed, experienced men. Running away in the middle of the night felt cowardly. It felt foolish. No, I said, making a decision. We stay. We keep the kids close.
No one goes out alone, not even to the truck. We keep the rifles handy. We're safe in the cabin. It's a solid building. We'll hunt closer to the road tomorrow, away from that ravine. We just need to be smart, cautious. Cal nodded slowly, though he didn't look convinced. All right, Ben. Cautious it is. He looked out into the blackness. I'm going to load the shotguns, just in case. I didn't argue. We went back inside and tried to pretend everything was normal. Cal oiled and loaded a pair of 12-gauge pump-action shotguns, placing one by the front door and one by the back. Brian watched him, a smirk on his face. Getting a little paranoid in your old age, Uncle Cal? It's just a bear. Humor me, Cal said without looking at him. We turned in early. I was exhausted, but I knew sleep wouldn't come easy. I lay in my bed in the small back bedroom, listening to the sounds of the old cabin. The creak of settling logs, the whisper of the wind against the window pane. I had my .30-06 hunting rifle leaning against the nightstand. It wasn't much comfort. I must have drifted off because I was jolted awake by a sound. It was a low, rhythmic scratching. It came from the outside wall of my bedroom. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was slow, deliberate, not the frantic scrabbling of a raccoon or a squirrel. This was heavy. I could feel a faint vibration through the log wall. I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart pounding. I held my breath, straining to hear. The scratching stopped. Silence. I waited, every muscle tensed. Then I heard it again, this time at the window. A soft, wet sound. A sniff. A long, deep inhalation right against the glass. My blood ran cold. I slowly reached for the rifle, my fingers closing around the cool steel of the barrel. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. The window was high and covered by a thick curtain, but I could feel a presence there, just on the other side of the thin pane of glass. It was tall. Whatever was sniffing my window had to be at least 7 feet tall to reach it. Then came a sound that would be seared into my memory for the rest of my life. It was a growl, but that word is insufficient. It was a low, guttural vibration that seemed to come from a chest cavity the size of a barrel. It wasn't the angry roar of a bear. It was a sound of predatory contemplation, a sound of hunger. It resonated through the walls, through the floor, right into my bones. The sniffing and the growling went on for what felt like an eternity. I sat frozen, my rifle clutched in a white-knuckled grip, waiting for the glass to shatter, for the wall to splinter. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I heard heavy footsteps, not the 4-footed gait of an animal, but the 2-footed tread of a man, crunching on the frosted leaves as it moved away from my window and toward the front of the cabin. I slid out of bed, my bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor. I crept to my door and opened it a crack. The main room was dark, lit only by the faint orange glow of the dying embers in the fireplace. I saw Cal, a dark silhouette by the front window, his shotgun held at the ready. He had heard it too. I slipped out to join him. "Did you hear it?" I whispered. "Hear it? I felt it," he breathed back. "It walked right across the porch. The whole floor shook." As he spoke, we heard a new sound. The front doorknob began to turn, slowly, deliberately, back and forth, testing the lock. My mind reeled. A bear doesn't do that. A coyote doesn't do that. No animal I knew of in the North American continent tests a doorknob. The rattling stopped. There was a long pause. Then a tremendous thud hit the door, making the entire frame shudder. It wasn't a frantic blow. It was a solid, calculated push, a test of strength. Another thud, harder this time. The door groaned, the wood protesting. From the loft above, a terrified voice squeaked. "What was that?" It was Alyssa. "Stay up there," Cal hissed, his voice tight with command. We heard Brian's voice, trying to be reassuring. "It's nothing, babe, just the wind." "That's not the wind," she cried. Another massive shove hit the door. A splintering sound echoed through the cabin. The deadbolt was holding, but for how long? Cal and I stood side by side, our guns aimed at the door, waiting for it to burst open. Then, silence again. We waited, our hearts in our throats. 1 minute. 2. 5. Nothing. The presence, whatever it was gone. "It's playing with us," I whispered, a horrifying realization dawning on me. "It's testing the defenses. It's smart." Cal just nodded, his face a grim mask in the dim light. We didn't go back to bed. We spent the rest of the night sitting in the dark, guns in our laps, listening to the silence that was somehow more terrifying than the noise had been. Every gust of wind, every creak of the house, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through me. Just before dawn, as the first hint of gray light began to filter through the windows, I crept to the window in my room. I needed to see. I gently pulled back a corner of the curtain and peered out. The frost-covered ground was a patchwork of shadows and pale light. At first I saw nothing. Then, my eyes caught movement at the far edge of the tree line. A figure stepped out from behind a thicket of pines. It was huge, silhouetted against the growing light. It was standing on 2 legs, but they were bent backwards, like a dog's. It was covered in dark, shaggy fur. Its shoulders were immense, broader than any man's, and its arms were long, hanging down almost to its knees. It turned its head, and for a heart-stopping second, I saw its profile. A long, canine snout, pointed ears. It was the shape from a nightmare, a monstrous hybrid of man and wolf. It took one more look at the cabin, its head held high as if sniffing the air, and then it turned and melted back into the shadows of the forest. It didn't run. It moved with a fluid, loping stride that was unnervingly graceful for a creature of its size. I let the curtain fall, my hand shaking uncontrollably. I stumbled back from the window, my back hitting the wall. "Cal," I croaked. He was at my door in a second. "What? What did you see?" "It's out there," I said, my voice trembling. "I saw it. Cal, it's not an animal. Not like any animal we know." I tried to describe it. The dog-like head, the bipedal stance, the sheer impossible size of it. He listened, his expression growing darker with every word. When the sun was fully up, the morning felt like a cruel joke. The light streamed into the cabin, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Birds started singing. It was a beautiful autumn morning, and it felt like a lie. We heard stirring from the loft. A few minutes later, Brian and Alyssa came down the stairs. Brian was trying to project an air of nonchalant bravado, but his eyes were wide, and he looked like he hadn't slept. Alyssa was pale and drawn, clutching his arm like a lifeline. "Morning," Brian said, his voice a little too loud. "Crazy storm last night, huh? Sounded like a tree fell on the porch." Cal and I just looked at him. There was no point in arguing.
"We're leaving," I said, my voice flat and final. "Pack your things. Now." Brian's jaw dropped. "Leaving? We just got here. What the hell for? Because of some wind?" "It wasn't the wind, Brian," Cal said, his patience finally snapping. "There's something out there. Something dangerous. We're getting out of here while it's light." "Oh, come on," Brian protested. "You're letting a little noise spook you? I thought you guys were supposed to be the experts." "It was a bear trying to get at the trash."
We're in the middle of the woods. What do you expect? There is no trash outside, I stated calmly, and a bear did not try to turn the doorknob. We are leaving. That's not a request. I walked over to the front door. I took a deep breath and unlocked the deadbolt. I pulled the door open and looked out. The porch was covered in a thick layer of frost, sparkling in the morning sun, and in the middle of the frost were two enormous five-toed tracks, vaguely canine, but with a long, almost human-looking heel. They were identical to the prints we'd found by the deer carcass. Beside them, on the door itself, were long, deep gouges in the wood, as if a rake made of knives had been dragged down it. "Brian," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "Come here." He swaggered over, the skeptic ready to debunk our fears. He looked at the tracks. He looked at the claw marks on the door. The color drained from his face. His bravado evaporated, replaced by a dawning, sickening fear. He stared at the tracks, his mouth slightly open. He touched the edge of one of the gouges in the door with a trembling finger. What made that?" he whispered. "We don't know," Cal said, coming to stand behind him, "and we're not sticking around to find out. Pack your bags." This time, there was no argument. We moved with a frantic, desperate energy. We threw our gear into bags, not caring how it was packed. Every minute we spent in that cabin felt like a minute borrowed from a dwindling supply. Alyssa was crying softly, her hands shaking so badly she could barely zip her suitcase. Brian was silent, his face pale and grim, all his earlier cockiness gone. Cal and I kept our guns in our hands. While the others packed, we did a quick perimeter check. We found more tracks at the back of the cabin and saw where the creature had scraped at the logs of my bedroom wall. The bark was shredded, the wood underneath splintered. The sheer power it possessed was terrifying. Then we went to the truck, and our frantic hope of a quick escape died. All 4 tires were slashed. Not just punctured, but sliced open with brutal, deep cuts that ran halfway around the sidewalls. They were utterly destroyed. We stood there, staring at the ruined tires, and the full gravity of our situation crashed down on us. We were stranded, miles from any paved road, with no cell service, and night was coming. And there was something in the woods that wanted to get to us. "It's smart," Cal breathed, his voice full of a terrible awe. It knew this was our only way out. "It's hurting us," I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "It wants us in the cabin. It wants us trapped." Brian made a choked, gagging sound. No, this can't be happening." "Get back inside," Cal barked, his military training kicking in. "Now, move!" We scrambled back into the cabin, the heavy wooden door feeling like a flimsy shield. Cal bolted it, then wedged a heavy wooden chair under the knob. We did the same for the back door. The afternoon sun was already beginning its descent, the shadows of the trees stretching like long, dark fingers toward the cabin. Panic began to set in. Alyssa was now openly sobbing, huddled on the couch. Brian was pacing back and forth, muttering to himself. This is a joke. It's got to be a prank. Someone is messing with us. With what, Brian? I snapped, my own fear making me harsh. A 7-foot-tall dog costume and hydraulic claws? Nobody is messing with us. This is real. Cal took charge. All right, listen up. Panicking is not an option. It will get us killed. We have food, we have water, we have shelter, we have firearms. We are going to fortify this cabin and we are going to survive until we can get out of here. His voice, calm and authoritative, cut through the rising hysteria. We looked at him, desperate for a plan. Ben, you and I are on watch.
Ryan, your job is to keep the fire stoked. I want it roaring. The more light, the better. And find anything we can use to barricade the windows. Furniture, anything heavy. Alyssa, I need you to boil water. Fill every pot, every bottle we have. It worked. Having tasks, having a purpose, seemed to stave off the terror. We moved with a grim determination. Brian, his face streaked with tears, started heaving couches and tables against the windows on the ground floor. Alyssa, her sobs reduced to shuddering breaths, filled pots at the sink. Cal and I took up positions, him at the front, me at the back, guns at the ready. The afternoon wore on. The sun dipped below the ridge, and the woods were plunged into a deep, foreboding twilight. The temperature plummeted. Inside, the cabin was an oven from the roaring fire, but a different kind of cold had settled deep in my bones. As dusk settled, the sounds began. It started with a howl.
A long, mournful, terrifying howl that was too deep for a wolf, too complex for a coyote. It was answered by another from a different direction, and then a third. They were circling us. There were at least 3 of them. Then came the scraping again, on all sides of the cabin at once, the sound of heavy claws dragging against the log walls, a low, continuous growling that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. They were testing the entire perimeter, looking for a weak point. Alyssa dropped a pot with a loud clang and let out a small scream. "Stay calm," Cal commanded, his voice never wavering. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the kitchen. We all spun around. A rock, the size of a bowling ball, had smashed through one of the smaller kitchen windows, showering the floor with glass. Cold night air flooded in. Through the broken pane, I saw a flash of movement, a dark shape disappearing back into the blackness.
"They're throwing things!" Brian yelled, his voice cracking with terror. Before we could even process that, another rock hit the front of the cabin, striking the wall next to the main window with a deafening boom. They were trying to break their way in. The next hour was a blur of pure, unadulterated terror. Rocks hailed down on the cabin, smashing the remaining windows. We huddled in the center of the room, away from the flying glass, the sounds of the assault echoing in the enclosed space. The creatures were roaring now, guttural, blood-curdling bellows of rage and hunger. Then it stopped. The sudden silence was almost as terrifying as the noise. "What now?" Alyssa whimpered. "They're changing tactics," Cal said, his eyes scanning the shattered windows. "They know that didn't work. They're thinking." And that's when it happened. Brian, who had been getting more and more agitated, finally snapped. "I can't do this! I can't just sit here and wait for them to get in." Before any of us could react, he ran to the back door. He kicked the chair away, fumbled with the deadbolt, and threw the door open. He had Cal's spare rifle in his hands. "Brian, no!" Cal screamed. But it was too late. Brian stepped out onto the back porch, raising the rifle. "Get away from here, you bastards!" he screamed into the darkness. For a second, there was nothing. Then from the darkness to his left, a shape lunged. It was impossibly fast, a massive dark form that unfolded from the shadows. I saw a long arm, impossibly long, whip out. It didn't grab him, it swatted him, a single contemptuous backhand blow. The sound was sickening, a wet crunch of bone. Brian was lifted off his feet and thrown across the small porch, his body slamming into the far railing with enough force to shatter it. He didn't even scream. The creature stepped into the light of the doorway, and I saw it. I saw it all.
It stood over 8 feet tall, its massive shoulders hunched. Its body was a grotesque parody of a man's, covered in thick, matted black fur. Its legs were digitigrade, bent like a dog's, ending in huge clawed feet. Its arms were grotesquely long and powerful, with hands that were almost human, but tipped with thick, yellowed claws. But the head, God, the head. It was the head of a monstrous wolf or a German shepherd, with a long snout and intelligent, burning yellow eyes. Its lips were pulled back in a silent snarl, revealing rows of thick, dagger-like teeth. A string of saliva dripped from its jowls. It looked at us, at me and Cal in the doorway, and there was no animalistic blankness in its eyes. There was intelligence. There was malice. It bent down, grabbed Brian's limp body by the ankle, and dragged him off the porch and into the darkness as easily as I would pick up a bag of leaves. The whole thing took less than 5 seconds. Alyssa let out a scream that was no longer human. It was the raw, pure sound of a soul breaking. Cal reacted instantly. He slammed the back door shut and threw the bolt. He didn't even try to replace the chair. We both knew it was useless. We stumbled back into the center of the room, our minds reeling from the horror we had just witnessed. We heard a wet, tearing sound from outside, followed by the crunch of bone. They were eating him, right outside our door. Alyssa collapsed, her mind finally shutting down to protect her from the unbearable reality. She curled into a ball on the floor, silent and catatonic. Cal and I stood over her, our guns hanging uselessly at our sides. The sounds from outside continued. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. We had just watched a monster from the deepest pit of hell drag a member of our party away and devour him. The night descended into a true siege. The creatures, emboldened by their kill, renewed their assault. They weren't just throwing rocks anymore. They were physically trying to tear the cabin apart. We could hear their claws gouging at the logs, their immense weight pushing against the walls, making the whole structure groan. One of them appeared at the large, shattered front window. It pushed its horrifying head and shoulders through the broken frame, ignoring the jagged shards of glass that tore at its fur. Its yellow eyes scanned the room, landing on me. I raised my rifle, the sights shaking in my hands. I aimed for the center of its chest and fired. The .30-06 boomed in the confined space, the muzzle flash momentarily blinding me. The creature roared, a sound of pure agony and rage this time, and recoiled, pulling itself back out of the window. We heard it crash to the ground outside. "Did you get it?" Cal yelled over the ringing in my ears. I hit it. I hit it square. But our hope was short-lived. The roar of pain was answered by furious bellows from the other two. The assault intensified. A massive impact struck the front door, and this time the wood splintered, the frame cracking. They were using their bodies like battering rams. "The loft!" Cal shouted. "Get Alyssa! We have to get up to the loft!" I slung my rifle over my shoulder and scooped the unresponsive Alyssa into my arms. She was limp, dead weight. Cal provided cover, firing his shotgun through the broken windows at the dark shapes that darted past. The spiral staircase felt a mile long. I half carried, half dragged her up the steps,
We reached the loft, a small open space with 2 beds and a single window overlooking the back of the cabin. Cal came up right behind me, turning to aim his shotgun down the stairs. Down below, the front door finally gave way. It burst inwards with a deafening crack of splintering wood torn from its hinges. A massive, dark shape filled the doorway. It was another one, slightly smaller than the first, but just as terrifying.
It stepped into the cabin, its claws clicking on the wooden floor. It sniffed the air, its head turning, its yellow eyes glowing in the firelight. Cal fired the shotgun. The blast echoed like a cannon. The creature staggered back, roaring, peppered with buckshot, but it didn't fall. It was wounded, enraged, but it was still coming. The other one, the one I had shot, appeared at the broken front window again. It was bleeding from a dark patch on its shoulder, but it seemed more furious than hurt. It clambered through the window into the room. Now there were 2 of them inside. They saw us in the loft. The first one started towards the spiral staircase. It was too big to climb it properly. It placed a huge clawed hand on the central pole and began to pull, testing its strength. The entire staircase groaned and shifted. It was trying to tear it down. "Shoot it!" I yelled, laying Alyssa behind one of the beds. Cal fired again. The creature at the base of the stairs took the full blast in its side. It howled and stumbled, but its companion was already moving, lunging for the staircase. I raised my rifle and fired, the bullet hitting the second one in the leg. It snarled and its leg buckled, but it kept coming. We were trapped. They were going to tear the stairs down and we would have nowhere to go. I looked around desperately. There was the single window at the back of the loft. It was our only chance. It was a 12-foot drop to the hard, frozen ground below, but it was better than staying here. "The window!" I yelled to Cal. "We have to jump!" He looked at me, his face grim. He knew it was a suicide mission, but it was the only mission we had left. He nodded. "Cover me." He ran to the window and smashed it open with the butt of his shotgun. As he did, the creature I'd shot in the leg made a lunge for the stairs. It was wounded, slower, but still terrifyingly powerful. I fired my last round, hitting it in the chest. It fell back with a shuddering groan, finally collapsing in a heap at the bottom of the stairs. But the first one, the big one, was enraged. With a final furious roar, it gave a tremendous heave on the staircase's central pole. There was a sound of tortured metal and splintering wood, and the entire structure tore away from the loft floor. It collapsed into the room below with a deafening crash, leaving us stranded. "Go!" Cal screamed, turning from the window. "Get her out of here!" He shoved me toward the opening. I looked down. The third creature, the one we hadn't seen in a while, was standing right below, looking up at us. It had been waiting. It had been herding us to this exact spot. Cal saw it too. He didn't hesitate. "Ben, you have to go. Now. Throw her down, then jump. I'll hold them off." He turned back to the gaping hole where the stairs had been, raising his shotgun. The big one was trying to climb the wall to get to us. I looked at Alyssa's vacant face, then at Cal's determined one. I couldn't leave him, but I couldn't stay. He made the choice for me. "That's an order, damn it! Go!" he yelled, and fired his last shell down into the face of the climbing monster. I didn't think. I just acted. I picked up Alyssa, took a deep breath, and shoved her out the window. She fell, a limp bundle, and landed with a sickening thud on the frozen ground. The creature below was startled by her sudden appearance, taking a step back. That was my only chance. I scrambled onto the windowsill and jumped. I aimed for a patch of bushes near where she'd landed, hoping to break my fall. I hit the branches hard, the impact jarring every bone in my body. Pain shot up my leg. I
think I broke my ankle. But I was alive. I was out. I heard a triumphant roar from inside the cabin, followed by a human scream of defiance and pain that was cut short. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I crawled on my hands and knees to Alyssa.
She was unconscious, but breathing. I hoisted her over my shoulder in a fireman's carry, the pain in my ankle screaming in protest. And I ran. I half ran, half limped into the blackness of the forest, away from the sounds of the cabin, away from the light. I just picked a direction and went, crashing through the undergrowth, branches whipping at my face. I could hear the creatures behind me, roaring in frustration and rage. They were looking for me. I don't know how long I ran, an hour, a lifetime. My lungs burned, my ankle was a white-hot ball of agony. Every step was a fresh wave of torture. But I didn't stop. The image of Cal standing his ground was all that kept me going. I couldn't let his sacrifice be for nothing. Eventually, through the trees, I saw the faint, telltale reflection of light on wet pavement. A road. I stumbled out of the woods and collapsed onto the cold, hard asphalt of the main highway. I was miles from the cabin. I had made it. I lay there on the road, Alyssa's unconscious form beside me, and for the first time since it all began, I wept. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance. I waved my arms weakly. The car, a beat-up sedan, slowed and stopped. A young couple stared at me, their faces a mixture of fear and concern. I must have been a terrifying sight, covered in dirt and blood, my clothes torn, my face a mask of horror. "Please," I croaked. "Help us." They drove us to the town of Davis, to the emergency room at the local hospital. They treated my broken ankle and Alyssa's concussion. She was still unresponsive, trapped in a protective coma. The state police were called. I sat in a small, sterile room, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, and I told my story to a county sheriff named Miller. He was a big man with a tired face and skeptical eyes. He listened patiently, taking notes on a small pad. I told him everything: the deer, the tracks, the scratching, the doorknob, the attack, Brian, Cal, the creatures. When I finished, he put his pen down and sighed, rubbing his temples. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice laced with a weary condescension. "You've all been through a major trauma. Your friend Brian is missing. Your other friend, Cal, is unaccounted for. You've got a broken ankle. The young lady has a head injury. It's my professional opinion that you encountered a bear. A large, aggressive black bear." "A bear doesn't slash 4 truck tires," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of grief and rage. "A bear doesn't turn a doorknob. A bear doesn't throw rocks. Did you not hear a word I said? I was a DNR officer for 30 years. I know what a goddamn bear looks like." "Stress can make people see things, Ben," he said, using my first name as if we were old friends. "You were scared. It was dark. Your mind filled in the blanks. We'll send a team out to the cabin at first light. We'll find your friends. My guess is Brian panicked and ran into the woods, got lost. Cal probably went after him. We'll find them." I just stared at him, a wave of utter helplessness washing over me. He didn't believe me. Of course he didn't. Why would he? My story was insane. It defied every law of nature we hold to be true. I was just another hysterical victim, my mind broken by trauma. They sent a search party the next day. They found the cabin just as I'd described it. Destroyed. They found the blood. They found Cal's shotgun. They never found Cal. Or Brian.
Not a trace. Not a bone, not a scrap of clothing. The official report listed them as missing, presumed victims of an animal attack, likely a black bear, complicated by disorientation and exposure. My testimony was noted in the file as the statement of a witness suffering from extreme shock and trauma. A footnote. The slashed tires were attributed to vandalism by poachers we must have startled. The dead deer was a normal predator kill.
Everything I described was explained away with a neat, tidy, and completely wrong explanation. The case was closed. A week later, as I was being discharged from the hospital, a young deputy, one who had been at the initial interview, pulled me aside in the hallway. He looked nervous. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice low, "I'm not supposed to be talking to you, but I believe you." I looked at him, surprised. "My granddad was a logger up in these hills his whole life," he continued, glancing over his shoulder. "He used to tell stories, things he'd seen back in the deep woods. Tall, hairy things with dog heads that walked like men. He called them the shepherds. Said they were the reason some places in the forest are always silent. Everyone just said he was a crazy old drunk." The deputy looked me square in the eye. "I never put much stock in it. Until now. Don't go back there, Mr. Carter."
Don't ever go back. He squeezed my arm, then turned and walked away, leaving me standing there in the cold, sterile hallway, alone with the terrible, validated truth. I sold my house in Elkins. I couldn't stand being that close to the mountains anymore. I moved to a small apartment in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio. Flat land, streetlights, the constant hum of traffic. I haven't set foot in a forest since that day. I can't. Sometimes at night I can still hear the growls. I can still see those burning yellow eyes. I see Cal standing his ground on the edge of the loft. Survivor's guilt is a heavy burden. Alyssa never fully recovered. She spent months in a psychiatric facility. Her memory of that night is a complete blank. Maybe she's the lucky one. Her parents moved her out west somewhere. I never heard from her again. So now, I'm just a broken old man in a city that's not my home, haunted by things I can't explain to anyone who would believe me. I know what I saw. I know what took Brian and Cal. They weren't bears. They weren't a product of stress or fear. They were real. They're still out there, in the deep, dark places of the world where the maps are blank and the cell service doesn't reach. So, if you're ever in the woods and the birds suddenly go silent and you get that cold, primal feeling of being watched, listen to it. Turn around. Go back to your car. Lock your doors and drive away. Don't try to be brave. Don't try to be rational. Just leave. Because some things aren't meant to be understood. They're only meant to be survived.